Hello and welcome to the cultural bias section of Issues and Debates. Just to give you some context, much of our traditional psychological research represents a Western bias, which is hardly surprising because most of the world's psychologists are trained in the West, and most of the participants in psychological research are from Western cultures. So this would mean that most psychological theories and research techniques have a basis in a Western worldview. When this knowledge base is applied to members of other cultures, it reflects what we call a cultural bias. However, as developing countries also start to increase their involvement in psychological theory and research, this bias is slowly being addressed. So, in this section, we're going to have a look at a few things. We're going to discuss cultural bias, cultural relativism, ethnocentrism. But before we get on to that, I'd like you to have a quick look at this Australian IQ test on the screen and just ask yourself the question, how would you score if given the following questions? So these items relate to the culture of the Edward River community in far north Queensland. So just pause the video, have a look at the questions, see what you think, and I will provide some feedback in a moment. So as you can see, these questions are quite particular to that community. So although you will probably do all right on some of these questions, some of them are probably not very relevant to you as an individual within your culture. So you can see the problem here with this kind of research. And, keeping in mind this is an IQ test, it's a measure of ability levels. What happens with the results of an IQ test like this, and how can we generalize the results of a test like this if they're not that relevant to the people that they are set for? So psychology is predominantly a white Euro-American enterprise. So just some stats here, 64% of psychological researchers are from the US. In some texts, more than 90% of the studies have US participants, and the samples are predominantly white middle class. But the big problem here is that psychology purports to tell us about human nature. So can this really be true? So what you need to know in this section, you need to know the terms ethnocentrism and cultural relativism, and it would be good to know emics and ethics, and then problems in cross-cultural contact. So let's move on to types of theoretical constructs. So just to be clear on what a construct is, it's really an idea or a theory containing various conceptual elements, typically ones that are considered to be subjective and perhaps not based on entirely empirical evidence. So we're talking about theoretical constructs here, which are sort of ideas that are made up of different concepts. So we've got emics and ethics. So emics are the constructs particular to a specific culture. So the ideas and the theories around what makes that culture unique. Ethics are constructs that are universal to all people. So things that apply to all of us as human beings. So, bias in research can occur when emics and ethics get mistaken for each other. So, emic constructs are specific to a particular culture, so they vary from place to place. They are likely to be ignored or misinterpreted if they are not considered by people within that culture. Researchers from one culture may not be sensitive to local emics. Their own cultural filters may prevent them from detecting them or appreciating their significance. So, for example, views on gender could be an example here. So, coming from having a view on a particular gender or having views on what gender could be may prevent you from detecting or appreciating the significance of someone else's view on gender. So here are a couple of examples in terms of emic research, and how perhaps different cultures would interpret this kind of research and how they would think about it. Um, so the Mojave Indians recognize four gender roles: traditional male and female, um, Alia males who choose to live as women, mimicking menstruation by cutting their upper thighs and undergoing a ritualistic pregnancy, and the Hawami are females choosing to live as men. The other example here are the Thai Katuis, who have male genitalia but dress in women's clothing. So they are not men wanting to be women, nor are they trapped inside a man's body like Western transsexuals sometimes describe themselves. Katuis take pride in their male genitalia and do not wish to be accepted as women. They act in a loud, brash way that violates the norms of femininity in Thai culture. So some researchers may look at these types of cultures um, from from their perspective, um, and perhaps not appreciate the nuances and the role of these gender roles within these communities. And this is where cultural bias can often occur in Western research. So ethic constructs are assumed to be universal, but may not be. And this can lead to what we call as imposed ethics, where a construct, an idea, or theory, for example, from one culture, is applied inappropriately to another. So, an example of imposed ethic is Ainsworth's strange situation for attachment, um, where they used a Western methodology to measure attachment cross-culturally. And you may think that it's not appropriate for assessing children from non-US or UK populations because the original research was done um, on US children. So the cultural differences in child rearing styles make results liable to misinterpretation, and this can be seen in some of the results in German or the German and Japanese samples um, that were seen. So something to really keep in mind when researching, doing cross-cultural research, and looking at meta-analysis, especially. Um, how many of those studies were cross-cultural, and are the methods fit for purpose? And are there any examples of imposed ethic in those situations? So the big problem here is what we call ethnocentrism. And this occurs when a researcher assumes that their own culturally specific practices or ideas are natural or right. So when other cultures are observed to differ from the researcher's own, they may be regarded in more of a negative light. So in the past, maybe not so much nowadays, but in the past you would have had terms such as primitive, degenerate, unsophisticated, or undeveloped aspects coming out of the research, where perhaps it was just because it was done from a Western perspective. This can become racism when other cultures are denigrated or their traditions are regarded as irrelevant, etc. So ethnocentrism can be quite difficult when it comes to research and has to be considered very carefully when any research is done. So an example of ethnocentrism um, is IQ testing and research. So IQ tests that were developed in the West typically contain embedded assumptions about intelligence, but what counts as intelligent behavior varies from culture to culture. So non-Westerners may be disadvantaged by such tests and then viewed as inferior when they don't perform as Westerners do. And perhaps you can just think back to that uh, Australian IQ test that we did at the beginning and think about the assumptions that are made in that test. Here is another example where Luria gave Russian rural dwellers the following test question: which is the odd one out? Hammer, axe, log, saw. And the right answer was log, but all his sample said hammer. And I suppose you can start questioning, did this mean that they didn't know anything? So we've got to then question whether this research was perhaps a bit culturally biased. So the big question, can we avoid cultural bias? Remember that all cultures are not the same. So the individualist collectivist dimension reminds us of this, but it is still quite a gross simplification, because within the individualist collectivist dimension, you've got a lot of subcultures in there that live quite differently, and uh, you know they have certain deviations on the main culture. Also, the greater use should be made of research conducted from within each culture by members of that culture. So we're looking to perhaps take more of an emic approach here. And cross-cultural research should be encouraged. So two possible approaches when conducting cross-cultural research can be used is the cross-cultural approach, which means you can study many different cultures to identify the variations um, between the cultures and within the cultures. And then you've got transcultural approach, which means you would study many different cultures to identify similarities between them. And when doing this, you need to be aware of all the pitfalls that we have already considered here. So some of the barriers or the problems associated with conducting cross-cultural research may be that perhaps the researchers may be unable to relinquish their own cultural worldview, which may always influence their interpretations, and therefore they will be imposing an ethic really across the results, etc. The barriers to communication are numerous as well. So gaining the trust of informants, understanding what informants say, relying on interpreters if you're in a place where you don't perhaps know the language, ensuring equivalence in translation of the materials, etc. So you can see there are a lot of barriers that people face when they do cross-cultural research. But there is something to be said that if you are aware of these and you can control these variables, I suppose we would talk about extraneous variables in research, it is possible. So just to end with, we've got this term called cultural relativism, which is a very key idea that we need to think about when we are conducting cross-cultural research. It means to be, well, the implication of cultural relativism is that the research will be less biased. So this refers to the belief that it is essential to consider the cultural context when examining behavior in culture. So it also assumes that there is no global right or wrong. It varies across culture. So for example, culturally, there is a difference in attraction and the criteria for choosing a partner. There are cultures and subcultures where arranged marriages, for example, are preferable, and in other words, and in other, the focus is on the wealth of both partners to support the family. So it is quite key to keep an open mind when you're thinking about conducting cross-cultural research, and therefore, if you can adopt this attitude of cultural relativism when you're doing research, you are much less likely to have any cultural bias in your research. So just to end this section, there are 4 key terms I just want to remind you of in this section. So the word culture in itself, the rules, customs, morals, and ways of interacting that bind together members of a society or some other collection of people. And just to keep that in mind, that when we do cross-cultural research, it is going to be different in every place that we do it. In terms of cultural relativism, the view that behavior cannot be judged properly unless it is viewed in the context of the culture in which it originates. The next key term, cultural bias, the tendency to judge all people in terms of your own cultural assumptions. This distorts or biases your judgment. And then ethnocentrism, seeing things from the point of view of ourselves and our social group, evaluating other social groups of people using the standards and customs of one's own culture. Do have a look at page 45 of your textbook. The evaluation discussion sections on cultural bias are very useful. They talk about bias in research methods, consequences of cultural bias. It also talks specifically about the etic distinction, and interestingly looks at indigenous psychologies and how they go about looking at research. So do go and have a look at those evaluation points. They would be very helpful for you if you were needed to write an essay on this.